Anxiety is one of the oldest experiences recorded in human writing. It appears in Stoic letters, in Buddhist sutras, in the marginalia of medieval monks, in the personal diaries of Enlightenment philosophers. What changes across history is the explanation. What does not change is the experience itself, that specific quality of dread about what has not yet happened. The Stoics Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca built an entire philosophy partly in response to it. The Buddhist tradition, from the Pali Canon through Zen, addressed it with a different language, but an overlapping diagnosis. What is remarkable reading both is how much they agree about what anxiety actually is and where it actually comes from. Neither tradition is optimistic in the shallow sense. They do not tell you that everything will be fine. They do not promise that anxiety will disappear if you practice the right technique. They offer something more useful and more honest, a structural understanding of why anxiety arises and a practice for meeting it without being destroyed by it. In this conversation, we move through 5 truths drawn from both traditions that remain among the most useful observations ever made about the anxious mind. Not self-help, not therapy. Philosophy, the attempt to understand what anxiety is before deciding what to do with it. One preparation before we begin. These traditions ask something unusual of a reader. They ask you not just to understand their teachings intellectually, but to apply them experientially. Philosophy, for both the Stoics and the Buddhists, was not a set of propositions to agree with. It was a practice, something you return to every morning, in the texture of ordinary life. 5 truths. We begin with the one that both traditions placed at the foundation of everything else. Truth I. Anxiety lives in the gap between now and then. The Stoic diagnosis of anxiety begins with location. Anxiety does not live in the present moment. It lives in the imagined future, in scenarios that have not happened, may not happen, and whose shape you are constructing from your most frightened assumptions. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not as a command to be cheerful, but as an accurate description of where the problem lives." The Buddha's teaching on dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more precisely as the quality of unease or friction, points to the same structure. Most anxiety is not about what is happening. It is about what we are telling ourselves about what might happen. The mind narrates. The narrative frightens. And then we mistake the narrative for reality. Seneca put it plainly, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. This is not consolation. It is observation. The actual event, when it comes, is usually survivable because you have to deal with it as it is, not as you feared it would be. The imagined event has no such constraints. It can be as large and as terrible as your worst capacity for invention. The practice both traditions prescribe from this diagnosis. When you notice anxiety, locate it. Ask, is this happening now? Or am I constructing a future? Usually the honest answer is the latter. And that answer, by itself, without any further technique, slightly loosens the grip. You have identified the mechanism. Naming it does not eliminate it, but it changes your relationship to it. The Jetavana Grove at Sravasti was donated to the Buddha by a merchant named Anathapindika, who covered the ground with gold coins to purchase it. The grove became the place the Buddha spent more rainy seasons than anywhere else, 25 of them by some accounts. The monastery built there was where the most detailed teachings on the workings of the mind were given, not in a hall, but in the shade of mango trees, to lay practitioners who had come with ordinary lives and ordinary anxieties. Truth 2. What you can control is smaller than you think, and that is good news. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius returned to this distinction daily, not because it came naturally to him, but because it did not. His private notebooks, now published as the Meditations, record a man actively wrestling with the gravitational pull of anxiety about outcomes he could not control, the loyalty of his generals, the fidelity of his courtiers, the fate of Rome itself. What the notebooks reveal is not a man who had mastered the distinction once and was done with it, but a man who found it necessary to relearn it every morning. This is the most honest testimony available about how the practice actually works. It is not an insight that permanently resolves anxiety. It is a discipline that must be renewed, and that, renewed daily, gradually changes the texture of how the mind encounters uncertainty. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion, his handbook for life, with what may be the most practically useful distinction in all of ancient philosophy. Some things are up to us, he writes, and some things are not. Up to us, our judgments, our intentions, our responses. Not up to us, our bodies, our reputations, outcomes, other people's opinions, the weather of circumstance. Epictetus had been a slave in Rome under a master named Epaphroditus near the Palatine Hill before he was freed and eventually founded his school at Nicopolis. This biographical fact is not incidental to his philosophy. He built the dichotomy of control from the actual experience of having no control over his body, his location, his daily conditions, and discovering in that extremity that something remained ungoverned. His philosophy is autobiography. Most anxiety, by this framework, is anxiety about things that are not up to us. We are distressed about what other people will think, about whether we will succeed at something whose outcome depends partly on factors we cannot govern, about health, about the world, about circumstances we cannot control, and we are distressed precisely because we are treating these things as if our worry could change them. The Buddhist parallel is the teaching on control as delusion, the recognition that the self's project of controlling outcomes is itself a source of suffering. The Pali word upadana, usually translated as clinging, describes the mind's attempt to secure what is inherently unstable. Anxiety is often a symptom of this clinging. We are trying to hold onto a particular outcome, and the impossibility of the grip produces the dread. The good news, which both traditions emphasize, what is genuinely up to you is enough. Your attention, your effort, your honesty, your response to what arrives, these are real, they are available, and they are sufficient for living well. The anxiety that comes from trying to govern what you cannot govern dissolves when you redirect your energy toward what you actually can. The Antonine Plague arrived in Rome around 165 AD, while Marcus Aurelius was emperor. It killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people over 15 years. Marcus administered the response, the grain distributions, the mass burials, the military campaigns that continued despite the epidemic. The Meditations say nothing directly about the plague. They say everything about how to remain yourself when the world is dissolving. He was writing a manual for himself, not for history. Marcus Aurelius spent roughly a third of his reign on military campaign, most of it on the Danube frontier. The Meditations were written largely in that setting, in tents, in winter quarters, between battles. This matters because the philosophy he was working out was not hypothetical. The anxiety he was managing was about men dying under his orders, about an empire under genuine threat, about the daily responsibility of someone who could not hand the problem to anyone else. The practice worked, or did not work, in real conditions. Truth 3. The thinking mind is not a reliable narrator. Marcus Aurelius returned repeatedly in his private notebooks to a practice of observation, examining the thoughts as they arose, rather than simply believing them. Perceive at last, he wrote, that you have in yourself something better and more divine than what causes bodily passions and pulls you as a puppet. The mind's anxious narrations are events, not truths. Buddhist meditation practice makes this its primary project. The meditator is instructed not to stop thoughts, but to observe them, to notice. A thought is arising. To say, in effect, there is the mind doing the thing it does. The thought passes. Another comes. None of them is identical with the person doing the observing. This simple practice, maintained consistently, gradually transforms the relationship between you and your anxiety. Thich Nhat Hanh developed his teaching during the Vietnam War, when bombs were falling on monasteries and the question of anxiety was not philosophical but existential. He taught that the bell, the mindfulness bell at Plum Village, or any bell anywhere, is not a signal to relax. It is an invitation to return, to stop the narrative, to locate yourself in the body, in the breath, in what is actually present. The technique emerged from extreme conditions. It works in ordinary ones. The Stoic version of this is what they called prososh, attention to self, watching your own reactions as they form, before they translate into action or hardened belief. Epictetus trained his students to pause at the point of first impression. Wait. Don't be swept away. Examine what this actually is before you respond to it. The pause is the practice. Both traditions point to the same discovery. You are not your thoughts. Specifically, you are not your anxious thoughts. They arise in you the way weather arises in a sky real, sometimes powerful, but not the sky itself. The sky does not become the storm. The person who understands this, not just intellectually but experientially, has a fundamentally different relationship to anxiety. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote extensively about what he called interbeing, the recognition that nothing arises independently, that every state of mind contains the conditions that produced it. Anxiety, by this understanding, is not an enemy to be defeated, but a visitor carrying information about what is unexamined, what is unresolved, what the mind has not yet been willing to look at directly. The practice is not to push the anxiety away, but to sit with it long enough to hear what it is saying beneath the noise. Truth 4. The body knows before the mind does. Both the Stoics and the Buddhist practitioners of mindfulness recognize that anxiety announces itself in the body before the thinking mind has organized a narrative around it. Marcus Aurelius described the practice of catching impressions, the raw pre-verbal signal before the mind had dressed it in interpretation. The Buddhist body scan practice makes the same move in a different register, turning attention to the somatic texture of experience as it is, before the conceptual layer arrives to explain and amplify it. Anxiety held in the body as sensation, tight chest, shallow breath, contracted stomach is a different and more manageable thing than anxiety converted into a story about the future. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that the body is not merely a vehicle for the mind, but the primary site of intelligence itself. What he called the lived body, the body as experienced from within rather than observed from without, knows the world before abstract thought begins. This gives the Stoic and Buddhist practices a deeper philosophical grounding. Attending to the body during anxiety is not a workaround for people who cannot think clearly. It is a return to the most direct and least mediated form of knowledge we have. The body registers what is actually present. The mind, left to itself, generates what is feared but not yet real. Thich Nhat Hanh was expelled from Vietnam in 1966 for calling for peace from both sides of the war. He spent 39 years in exile before being permitted to return. He founded Plum Village in 1,982 inches, the Dodong, among stone farmhouses and walnut trees, deliberately choosing simplicity after decades of displacement. The bell he installed there, sounding every 15 minutes, was not a spiritual accessory. It was a technology for interrupting the anxiety that displacement and loss produce, refined through direct experience of both. Epictetus' school at Nicopolis attracted students from across the Roman Empire, sons of senators, young men of means, people who had read his reputation and traveled weeks to hear him. His classroom was simple, a single room in a modest house near the harbor. The simplicity was not accidental. A man who had been a slave and kept a limp for the rest of his life to remind him of what power could do, had no use for the architecture of status. His school looked like the philosophy it taught. Truth the fifth. Equanimity is not indifference, and the difference is everything. The Buddha taught what he called the near enemies of the four Brahma Viharas, the noble states of mind. The near enemy of equanimity is indifference. They look similar from the outside. Both involve a kind of calm, but their inner structures are opposite. Indifference is the calm of not caring. Equanimity is the calm of caring fully, but not being destabilized by what you cannot change. One is a closing off. The other is an opening that has learned to remain open without being swept away. Marcus Aurelius understood this distinction experientially. He cared deeply about Rome, about the soldiers dying on the Danube frontier, about the citizens dying in the Antonine Plague. The Meditations show a man who has not stopped caring, who in fact cares with extraordinary intensity, but who has learned not to be undone by caring. Equanimity, in his practice, was not the absence of concern. It was the quality of remaining present and functional inside the concern. That is a different achievement entirely, and a more difficult one. Epictetus taught that the goal of Stoic practice was not to become unfeeling, but to become undeceived. The passions that the Stoics called pathos, the disruptive emotions, were not wrong because they felt things. They were wrong because they were based on a false judgment about what was genuinely good or bad. Anxiety is a false judgment. It treats as threatening something that has not yet arrived and may never arrive in the form feared. Correct the judgment, and the anxiety loses its ground. The Buddha's teaching on equanimity, upekkha in Pali, was not his instruction to feel nothing. It was his instruction to feel everything without being defined by the feeling. The image he used was the sky and the weather. The sky does not choose its clouds. But the sky is not the clouds. The practitioner who has cultivated upekkha is not the person who no longer experiences anxiety. They are the person who can experience it without becoming it, who remains the sky while the weather passes. Epictetus taught his students to rehearse adversity, a practice the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, not as pessimism, but as preparation. If you have already imagined, honestly and in detail, the difficult outcomes your anxiety is constructing, you remove anxiety's main source of power, the sense that the feared thing is unthinkable. What has been thought through is no longer unthinkable. It has been brought within the circle of what you can meet. The Buddha taught the practice of impermanence not as a cause for grief, but as an antidote to a specific kind of anxiety, the anxiety of holding on. Everything that produces clinging anxiety is already changing. The relationship you fear losing is already different from what it was last year. The situation you are trying to secure is already shifting beneath your effort to secure it. Seeing this clearly not as a fact to memorize, but as a perception to cultivate, gradually loosens the grip that produces the dread. Marcus Aurelius's anxiety about his son Commodus is almost completely absent from the Meditations. He does not mention his children's names. He does not record his fears about succession. The notebooks are strikingly self-contained. They address only what Marcus could work on within himself. This absence is itself a philosophical statement. Some anxieties belong to the category of what is not up to us, and the discipline is not to resolve them, but to learn, morning after morning, not to let them colonize the available attention. Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching on the historical dimension and the ultimate dimension is one of his most useful contributions to the anxiety literature. In the historical dimension, the world of events, consequences, gains, and losses, anxiety makes complete sense. Real things are uncertain. Real harm is possible. But the ultimate dimension, which he sometimes called the ground of being, is the dimension in which nothing is ever permanently lost or gained. Access to that dimension does not require metaphysics. It requires only the sustained practice of returning to what is present here now. The Stoics identified a form of anxiety that is particularly insidious: anxiety about philosophy itself. The student who fears they are not progressing fast enough, who cannot tell whether the practice is working, who compares their interior state to an imagined ideal and finds themselves falling short. Epictetus addressed this directly. The person asking whether Stoicism is working has already demonstrated that something is working, because the question itself requires the detachment that the practice is meant to produce. Noticing your anxiety is not failure. It is the practice. The Buddha's teaching on the second arrow is perhaps the most practically immediate insight in all of the anxiety literature. The first arrow is the difficult event, the pain, the fear, the loss. The second arrow is what the mind does with the first, the narration, the amplification, the story about what it means and what will happen next. We cannot always prevent the first arrow. The second arrow is always a choice, even when it does not feel like one. The practice is learning to recognize the moment you pick it up. What the Stoic and Buddhist traditions share at the deepest level is a conviction about the direction of change. Both believe that the mind, worked on consistently and honestly, becomes capable of more than it was. Not perfect, not beyond difficulty, but genuinely more spacious, more flexible, more capable of meeting what arrives without being undone by it. The practice does not promise happiness. It promises a quality of engagement with life that makes anxiety a visitor rather than a resident. Marcus Aurelius on the shortness of human attention. How many a Chrysippus, how many a Socrates, how many an Epictetus have time already swallowed up? The anxiety about whether one's efforts matter, whether the work is significant enough, whether the life will have counted for something. The Meditations address this too. And the answer is not reassurance. It is reorientation. The question of whether it will last is the wrong question. The question is whether it is being done well, now, in the quality of this particular moment's attention. Thich Nhat Hanh's concept of the island within is his most direct response to the anxiety of displacement and rootlessness. In wartime Vietnam, the physical communities that sustained practiced the monasteries, the sanghas, the shaded paths, were being destroyed. His instruction to practitioners in those years was to carry the island within themselves, the space of stillness that the bell creates, the breath that returns regardless of where the body is. Anxiety about having no ground can be met by discovering that the ground was never entirely outside you. When you hold these 5 truths together, a single picture emerges. Anxiety is not a flaw of character or a chemical accident, though it has physiological dimensions. It is what happens when a thinking being is confused about where the danger actually is, what they can actually govern, and what quality of attention is actually available to them. Philosophy, the patient examination of these questions, is not a cure. But it is the oldest and most honest medicine we have. The Stoics practiced every morning. The Buddhists sat every day. Neither tradition believed that a single insight, however brilliant, was sufficient. Understanding, for them, was not a destination, but a practice, something you return to in ordinary life with each morning's light. The teaching is not the medicine. The teaching, applied daily, is the medicine. If this reached you at the right time, subscribe. We explore the deepest questions of human existence every week so you can live yours more fully.